We're used to thinking of mystery and suspense fiction as moving through space. Examples of the genre explore a variety of settings, including everything from the locked room to the country house, the suburb to the city, and even countries spanning the globe. But can mystery and suspense fiction move through time? This is a more complicated question than it might at first appear, because many of us tend to associate the genre with modernity. Why? Partly because of the genre-founding work of Edgar Allan Poe, which appeared in the 1840s. Consider how Poe's mystery tales can be set against issues like the growth of cities in the United States and the anxieties that growth caused, and the rise of organized police forces, which, as we've seen in another lecture in this course, Poe was deeply skeptical about. Mystery and suspense fiction has always been popular partly because it addresses contemporary issues. We can also see evidence of this fact in the Sherlock Holmes stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Remember that we first meet Holmes at the same time Dr. John Watson does, at the beginning of the novel A Study in Scarlet. Because Holmes is busy conducting experiments in a laboratory when this meeting takes place, we get a sense of the way in which Doyle presents Holmes as a man of his times, modern and up-to-date with respect to the kinds of knowledge he possesses and is able to use in his cases. And finally, the modernity of the private eye figure speaks for itself. From the moment this figure began to appear in the American pulp magazines of the 1920s, he was presented to readers as up-to-date with a vengeance. There was supposedly no shred of the Victorian gentleman amateur detective left about him. Instead, he moved through streets that his readers moved through and spoke in a way that his readers spoke, directly and without pretension. Given these examples, the concept of historical mystery and suspense fiction might seem like something of a contradiction. And yet, it is in fact a flourishing part of the genre. As we'll see in this lecture, many writers take the foundational elements of the genre and move them to earlier periods in human history as a way of exploring both continuities and changes between today and yesterday. Using mystery and suspense fiction conventions can also be a great way of translating aspects of earlier historical periods into terms that the modern reader can identify with. In doing so, historical mysteries expand the scope and popularity of the genre while also educating as well as entertaining their readers. We've discussed examples of historical mysteries in other lectures in this course, but for various reasons we didn't consider them primarily in terms of their being historical mysteries. When we discussed Walter Mosley's Easy Rawlins mysteries, in our lecture on black mystery fiction, for example, we focused on how Mosley's work was in dialogue with both classic hard-boiled writers like Raymond Chandler and other black mystery writers like Chester Himes. We spent more time discussing Mosley's representation of the city and the figure of the detective than we did discussing the fact that the Easy Rawlins novels, which began appearing in the 1990s, are set between the 1940s and the 1960s. In a similar vein, when we looked at Marty Oakley Medawar's Tay Bodal mystery series in our lecture on Native American mysteries, which is set in the second half of the 19th century, we focused mainly on how Medawar's work compares to that of other writers of Native American mystery and suspense narratives, such as Tony Hillerman and Linda Hogan, rather than considering how and why Medawar uses her historical setting. Our focus in this lecture will be very different. We'll look at two types of historical mysteries. The first are single novels by authors known primarily for writing literary fiction, who draw upon the conventions of mystery and suspense fiction to achieve their goals when revisiting periods in the past. We'll examine both what these goals are and why these writers believe that the combination of the mystery genre and an historical setting is so effective. The second type of historical mystery fiction we'll discuss is mystery series that feature a single series protagonist who experiences a variety of adventures. By considering some of the similarities and differences between these two types, we'll focus on why historical mysteries are so popular among their legions of fans. The first author I'd like to discuss is Caleb Carr. For the first part of his career, Carr was known as a military historian, thanks to books such as America Invulnerable, The Quest for Absolute Security, from 1812 to Star Wars, and The Devil Soldier, The Story of Frederick Townsend Ward, which were well reviewed but only sold modestly. Incidentally, his father, Lucien Carr, was close friends with many of the beat writers, including Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, as a young man in the 1950s. Everything changed once Carr began to combine his interest in history with writing fiction. The result was The Alienist, which was published in 1994. This wasn't Carr's first novel. That was Case in the Promised Land, which had come out in 1980 and then basically disappeared without a trace. But it was his first historical mystery. The Alienist is set in New York City in 1896. Some of the novel's characters are historical figures, such as then New York City Police Commissioner and later President Theodore Roosevelt, and the journalist Jacob Riis, author of the trailblazing book of investigative photojournalism, How the Other Half Lives, which was published in 1890 and documented the desperate lives of New York City slum dwellers from all races and ethnicities. Carr combines these real-life personages with fictional characters in The Alienist in order to tell a story involving the search for a serial killer who murders and mutilates young male prostitutes. The novel's protagonist is the psychologist, Dr. Laszlo Kreisler, the alienist of the book's title, who creates what amounts to a psychological profile of the killer. Such a profile would have been an historical anomaly during the 1890s, and Carr is well aware of that fact. What's entertaining about the prospect, as well as the book as a whole, however, is how a concept and a figure familiar to readers of contemporary psychological thrillers is imported into a very different historical context. By collecting and studying what appeared to be minor clues, Kreisler and the other members of his investigative team theorized that the killer experienced sexual abuse as a child and had a very religious upbringing. Carr generates additional suspense by having Kreisler and his colleagues hunted not only by the killer himself, but also by various members of the establishment, who all have their own reasons for wanting to see the investigation fail. The Alienist was a big hit, and its success suggests several factors that contribute to the success of historical mystery fiction as a whole. First, the author needs to strike a balance between historical anomaly, such as moving a psychological profiler into the 1890s, and historical accuracy, such as the scrupulous attention based on painstaking historical research that Carr pays to recreating the sights, smells, and other characteristics of the metropolis of New York City at the end of the 19th century. The importance of this balance suggests that readers read historical mysteries both for the mystery elements and for the successful and convincing recreation of historical detail. Consequently, historical mysteries, like other forms of mystery and suspense fiction, tend to be judged according to whether or not they're realistic. But in this case, realism means accuracy with regard to historical recreation, rather than, say, with regard to characterization, although that can also be a factor. Reviews of The Alienist indicate that the second type of balance that often determines the fate of an historical mystery novel has to do with successfully combining historical research with a compelling mystery. Although most reviewers felt that Carr managed to pull this off, Stephen Dobbins in the New York Times Book Review argued that Carr's meticulous and detailed historical research was both a curse and a blessing. For although the novel's ostensible subject is who is killing these children, the real subject is New York City in the 1890s. Dobbins's remark indicates that historical mysteries can easily become overwhelmed by too much historical detail, in which case the mystery elements become subordinated to an extent that the reader might lose interest. It might seem like an obvious point, but readers of historical mysteries want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be transported to another historical setting and be simultaneously entertained by a good mystery yarn. When one of these elements dominates over the other, the novel flirts with failure. It's interesting to note that Carr went on to write another type of historical mystery narrative that tends to be judged by different standards. In 2005, he published The Italian Secretary, a further Sherlock Holmes adventure, in which Holmes and Watson investigate the murder of workers at Queen Victoria's Castle in Scotland. This type of historical mystery, which adapts a classic figure in the genre and attempts to add to that figure's reputation, tends to be judged in terms of fidelity to the original, a very specific kind of accuracy. I'm going to be kind to Carr and not say anything more about The Italian Secretary. As Carr himself wisely pointed out, only Conan Doyle can write real Sherlock Holmes. In his 2006 novel, The Interpretation of Murder, Jed Rubenfeld combines the use of real historical figures and the recreation of a historical place in an unusual and thought-provoking manner. Rubenfeld is a professor of law and began his career by writing highly regarded books on constitutional law, such as Freedom and Time, a theory of constitutional self-government, which was published in 2001. When he turned his hand to writing fiction, he was drawn to a particular incident in psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud's life that is itself something of a mystery. Freud only visited the United States once in his life, in 1909, and apparently the visit was nothing short of a disaster. When Freud was later asked what he thought of America, he replied that it was a colossal mistake. Inspired by this comment, in The Interpretation of Murder, Rubenfeld writes a speculative reconstruction of Freud's visit to the United States to find out what went wrong. Rubenfeld's creative answer is that Freud, along with real-life colleagues Carl Jung and Sandor Ferenczi, and the fictional American psychoanalyst Stratham Younger, all become involved in a murder investigation that takes place among the elite of New York City's wealthiest citizens. There are a number of factors that make The Interpretation of Murder a successful historical mystery, and some of them we've already seen in our discussion of Carr. Rubenfeld's attention to historical detail is meticulous, and his recreation of the sights and sounds of New York City in the first decade of the 20th century is creative and convincing. What really makes the novel work, however, is that just as Carr gets a lot of mileage from transporting the figure of the psychological profiler back to the 19th century, so Rubenfeld develops the full implications of the similarities that exist between the figures of the detective and the psychoanalyst. These similarities have been noted before by a number of writers, including the famed Slovenian cultural critic Slavoj Žižek. Among other things, they consist in a resemblance between the clue on the one hand and the symptom or the dream on the other. Rubenfeld's title, The Interpretation of Murder, is, of course, an allusion to Freud's famous 1899 book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Just as Freud is able to successfully decode and interpret details in dreams in order to build a larger narrative that resolves the patient's neurosis, so in Rubenfeld's novel, we see the founder of psychoanalysis and his colleagues working to interpret clues, some physical, but mostly psychological, to solve a mystery. It is an ingenious parallel, and Rubenfeld develops it very successfully. What the interpretation of murder also suggests is that, at least to some extent, the success of a historical mystery depends on what a reader brings to it. Historical mysteries are probably the most pedagogical examples of the mystery and suspense fiction genre, in the sense that an intrinsic part of their appeal lies in the expectation that readers will learn things about a historical period that they didn't know before. With this said, any given example of the historical mystery will likely work better and be more successful if the reader already has a little pre-existing knowledge of the period the novel is set in. And it certainly helps if the reader is familiar with the conventions of the mystery and suspense fiction genre. That way, the reader can appreciate how the author is both drawing upon and reworking aspects of those generic conventions in clever and creative ways. This is particularly true of The Name of the Rose, a famous novel published in 1980 by the Italian literary theorist Umberto Eco, which has at least as much, if not more, to say about the generic foundations of mystery and suspense fiction as it does about the historical period in which it's set. The Name of the Rose has been described as a medieval murder mystery. It's set in a monastery in northern Italy in the year 1327, and the plot revolves around an investigation into several murders that take place at the monastery. But this bold summary only scratches the surface of what Eco's novel really is. Apart from the historical mystery elements, The Name of the Rose is filled with literary, philosophical, theological, and historical references, mostly having to do with obscure medieval religious disputes, such as whether Jesus Christ owned the clothes he wore, and if he didn't, what are the consequences of this fact for the wealth of the Catholic Church? In addition, the novel also contains many passages in Latin and other languages. In short, this isn't a book you'd normally expect to be a bestseller, and yet that's exactly what it became. It sold more than 1 million copies in Italy, and when it was translated into English in 1983, the hardcover version sold another 1 million copies in the United States. The paperback rights sold for over $500,000, which was reportedly the largest sum of money ever paid for a paperback translation. A film adaptation directed by Jean-Jacques Annaud and starring Sean Connery was released in 1986, and the success of that film further confirmed The Name of the Rose's status as a publishing phenomenon. What can explain the extraordinary success of Eco's novel? I'd like to say it's his attention to historical detail, as befits an historical mystery novel, and to some extent that's true, but it's not the whole story. As I've indicated, Eco's reader does receive a large amount of information about historical events during the medieval period that were taking place outside the walls of the monastery, but much of that information is detailed rather than vivid. As for the world of the monastery itself, its daily habits and routines are recreated meticulously, but there's no getting around the fact that it's a spatially limited fictional world, filled with a numerically limited number of characters, very different from the teeming metropolis of New York City that we find in both Carr and Rubenfeld's work. In this regard, The Name of the Rose is closer to being a country house mystery in the Agatha Christie mode than it is a historical mystery in the more conventional sense. And perhaps this is the key to the novel's success. The Name of the Rose is filled with allusions, some obvious, some not so obvious, to various forms of mystery and suspense. Quite apart from being a historical mystery just because it's set in an earlier time period, Echo's novel is also a historical mystery in the sense that it's a history of the genre itself. It's filled with clues about the lurking presence of the genre's key figures and conventions that are there for the attentive and knowledgeable reader to note and contemplate. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. Echo's protagonist is an older Franciscan monk named William of Baskerville. The fan of mystery and suspense fiction will, of course, immediately recognize Baskerville as a nod to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's 1902 novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles. If we then suspect that William is meant to be modeled after Sherlock Holmes, we find much evidence to confirm that suspicion. Even though William is a monk, and is therefore a man of faith, unlike Holmes, in many ways he's also conspicuously modern in comparison to his medieval background. He places little confidence in biblical prophecies and is impatient with overly dogmatic thinking and nitpicking theological disputation. Instead, William relies on what passes for cutting-edge science in 1327. In this respect, he anticipates the Renaissance and the Enlightenment as much as he personifies medieval times. And to seal the deal, William is accompanied by a young novice named Adso of Melk, whose training William is in charge of. The fact that Adso is constantly learning from his mentor and that he chronicles William's sayings and deeds makes the comparison between Adso and Dr. John Watson very obvious. But as I said earlier, some of the references to mystery and suspense fiction in The Name of the Rose are much more subtle. William's main antagonist in the novel, the Professor Moriarty to his Holmes, if you will, is an elderly Spanish monk named Jorge of Burgos. Jorge controls access to the secrets of the monastery's labyrinthine library, in which lies a book that William desperately wants to access because it's the key to the mystery. As Echo points out in his postscript to the novel, library plus blind man could only equal Borges. In other words, as some but not all readers of Echo's novel will realize, Jorge of Burgos is a reference to Jorge Luis Borges, whose work we'll discuss in another lecture in this series. Borges was a blind Argentinian writer whose work often dealt with libraries and labyrinths, and who wrote hugely influential experimental mystery narratives. In The Name of the Rose, therefore, we have a highly self-conscious and artificial form of the historical mystery that works on a variety of levels simultaneously. It's a compelling and satisfying murder mystery, a detailed and evocative historical mystery, and a thought-provoking reflection upon both the strengths and weaknesses of some of the genre's foundational conventions. When looked at from this perspective, a final question is raised. How could this novel not have been a bestseller? Up to this point of the lecture, I've focused on standalone historical mysteries that help illuminate some of the defining characteristics of this type of mystery and suspense fiction as a whole. But no discussion of the historical mystery would be complete without acknowledging and examining the importance of series of novels to the historical mystery. When we consider this aspect of the genre, one name immediately rises above all others: Ellis Peters, the author of what is, in my view, the best and most successful historical mystery series in the genre's history. Ellis Peters is one of the pen names used by Edith Pargeter, who was born in Horsehay, England in 1913. Under her own name, Pargeter wrote a large number of historical non-mystery novels, beginning with Hortensius, Friend of Nero, which was published in 1936. She published her first crime novel, Fallen into the Pit, under her own name in 1951. But beginning with her second crime novel, 1959's Death Mask, she began using the pseudonym Ellis Peters for all her subsequent mystery fiction. Over the course of her career, Peters published 2 series of mystery novels. The first was a series of police procedurals featuring Detective Sergeant George Phelps that has a contemporary setting. After publishing 13 novels in the series, however, Peters reportedly felt ready to set herself a new challenge by writing historical mysteries that would allow her to combine her training and interest in history with the region in which she grew up, the border region between England and Wales. The result was a series of historical crime stories set in 12th century Shrewsbury, featuring Brother Cadfael, a monk and amateur detective. The first novel in the series, A Morbid Taste for Bones, a medieval whodunit, was published in 1977, and Peters went on to write a grand total of 20 novels in the series, concluding with Brother Cadfael's Penance, the 20th chronicle of Brother Cadfael, which was published in 1994, the year before Peters died. According to the critics Gina MacDonald and Michelle Theriault, in the Brother Cadfael series, Peters discovered the perfect fit for her varied interests, values, and inclinations, a forum for history, war, romance, religion, and mystery, all amid familiar landscapes, and for the exploration of universal concerns and esoteric medieval lore. This description is a useful summary of the defining characteristics of the series, but let's look more closely at the reason for its success. First, there's Brother Cadfael himself. Not unlike Echo's William of Baskerville, although Cadfael is a monk, he doesn't have much to say about religion, and it's not a major emphasis in the series. This is partly because Peters wants to use Cadfael to examine other aspects of medieval society, but also because Cadfael is a somewhat unusual monk. Although he now lives a cloistered life, he was previously a crusader and sailor, and Peters draws on Cadfael's varied life experiences throughout the series in order to help us understand how a monk can be such an effective amateur detective. Second, the setting of the series is extremely important. By choosing the border region between England and Wales, which was the site of much conflict and turbulence during the medieval period, Peters is able to explore not only conflicts between cultures, but also conflicts both between and within families. Combine this setting with the fact that each novel in the series is usually based on an actual historical event, such as the Siege of Shrewsbury in 1138, which forms the backdrop for the 1979 novel One Corpse Too Many. And the series has the degree of historical verisimilitude that discerning readers are looking for. And finally, there's the fact that Cadfael appears in a series of novels. This means that we have ample opportunity to become thoroughly familiar with both Cadfael and the vividly described fictional world he inhabits over a long period of time. Peters once commented that many perfectly good historical novels somehow set their characters at a terrible distance from us, as though they're not the same species. This is emphatically not the case with Peters's Brother Cadfael novels. In them, she is able to bridge the gap between past and present by recreating a detailed and evocative fictional world peopled with characters that are both very different from us, but who, in all their imperfections and even vices, resemble us more than we might care to admit. Perhaps this is the secret to the success of not only Ellis Peters's work, but also of mystery fiction as a whole.